Fertility Podcast has been sharing expert content and patient stories now for a whole decade. If this is your first listen, welcome. My name is Natalie Silverman and I launched the podcast once pregnant after ICSI treatment as I wanted to use my broadcasting background to lessen the taboo on this difficult topic. Whilst I spent the first year being anonymous, as my audience grew, so did I. And once I put my name to the pod, everything changed. Since then, I've continued to work in the patient advocacy space, and the Fertility Podcast has gone from strength to strength, so we thank you for your support. Kate joined me as co-host in 2019, and whilst I've loved every minute of making this for you, I love even more that you now have Kate at the helm as your host. Kate is an independent fertility nurse consultant, and you couldn't be in safer hands. I'm currently spending my days working hard with Fertility Matters at Work to help the workplace become more fertility friendly. For those of us trying to manage our jobs alongside trying to become parents, we're dedicated to helping you feel less alone. And if the Fertility Podcast has helped you in any way, please do take a moment once you've listened to hit the follow or subscribe button, and if you want to leave us a review, that would be amazing. Help us celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Fertility Podcast in style. Enjoy the show.
Can you imagine making the difficult decision to end your pregnancy for medical reasons? It's the decision that no one ever wants to be faced with. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Fertility Podcast. How are you? Before we launch into today's episode, I want to just tell you about a couple of little things. So firstly, I've got an interesting study that I want to share with you, and you might be interested in getting involved. So University of Plymouth are looking at investigating weight and fertility. And they're looking for women aged between 18 and 45 who are trying to conceive but are also trying to lose weight. Now, in the UK, weight loss medication is now widely available and is prescribed or is able to be purchased privately. And sadly, there have been no studies yet into these medications in relation to use before pregnancy. And it is recommended for sure that those people wishing to become pregnant should stop using weight loss medications before trying to conceive. But we're not quite sure how many people are aware of this, and therefore University of Plymouth are really interested in investigating this. So the aim of the study is to understand more about the use of weight loss medications in those who are overweight and its association with fertility and pregnancy intention. So I'd like to really understand a bit more about your views on this medication if you're using it, and the acceptability of delaying pregnancy after you finish your obesity treatments. So if you're interested in getting involved, I will put a link to the study in the show notes, and you can find out a little bit more. There's a short questionnaire to complete, which should take you about 10 minutes. And there is an option if you wanted to be interviewed at a later date as well to share your experiences further. So that's a little bit of interesting research for you. Secondly, really importantly, before we dive into this episode, just to give you a bit of a trigger warning, in this episode, we are going to be talking about termination for medical reasons. And it's quite an emotionally hard-hitting episode. So as usual, if you're not feeling particularly strong today, please take some time out, maybe save this one for later, and go and have a look in our back catalogue where we've got lots and lots of episodes. So today, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Anita Beckwith. Anita is a fertility and prenatal dietitian, and she was faced with making the decision to terminate her much wanted pregnancy for medical reasons. So without further ado, let's bring Anita in. Hi, Anita. Welcome to the Fertility Podcast.
Hi, Kate. Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. And I'm delighted that you're here to joining me today to talk about what is a really sensitive subject. And we've put a trigger warning on this episode to make sure that, people are, if they're tuning in, listening, feeling strong. Because if you're not feeling strong, this might not be the best episode for you. So we're going to be talking about the subject of termination for medical reasons. And as I mentioned, such a sensitive topic. And it's really important, isn't it, that we deal with this
really carefully, because it is a very sensitive and difficult subject for us to talk about, but also for people to listen to as well. But before we dive into that, tell me a little bit about your fertility journey prior to that, just so we've got a bit of background on you.
Yeah. So basically, my partner and I decided about 2017 that we were going to have a family. We went traveling in 2018, and we went to Central and South America, where Zika virus was quite high, and that can cause congenital abnormalities if the mother contracts it, and that's a mosquito-borne condition. So we delayed things till 2019, and then tried naturally, and couldn't conceive. So mid 2019. Had fertility checks, everything looked normal. We had that terminology of unexplained infertility. We did further checks. My partner had a high DNA frag. He did do a lot of cycling. There were things, we made adjustments to things. We had a round of IVF. We did great outcomes from our IVF. So 15 eggs and 8 fertilized. So we had 8 frozen embryos in the end of that.
That's good.
We during that time, COVID happened. So basically, we were literally next on the list in March 2020, and COVID happened. So we had to wait till later in the year. And in that time as well, we found potential another reason for my partner's DNA frag being so high, that as a chance of another scan, he found out he had renal cancer. So we had a huge, we were going through COVID, where I was going for IVF treatment alone, and he was going for his management of his cancer alone as well. So we had this huge time of quite uncertainty and shock, and it's a real trying time. We got back to the IVF treatment, and we ended up having 2 transfers that didn't stick. We had a miscarriage, and that brought us on to the TFMR. And we actually took some time. We didn't run things straight off after we'd had those 3 attempts. I wanted to sit back, think and plan with the precious embryos we had left, how we were going to then proceed. So we took a bit of time. So it was the latter part of 2021 where we had the transfer, which ended up being our TFMR. And so, you're always, when you've been on an infertility journey, you're always hesitant, and waiting for the next scan, waiting for the next check. And we got to that 20-week scan, and that's an anomaly scan. And I know often people think about that scan as a gender check and a gender reveal. And we went in, and the sonographers were looking and going through everything and doing all the checks, and we could see where they moved back and looked back at the brain and came off again, and then looked at other things, and then said, do you want to know the gender? And they said, congratulations, it's a boy. So at that point I thought, okay, we're taking some time here, and obviously those scans do take some time, and if people are very familiar with them, often you're sort of capturing little bits of whispers and bits of conversation that's going on, but you can't pick up everything. And then they kept going back. You could see they go through other parts of the body and come back to the brain, and then they called a doctor in. So you knew at this point, and I can't think how long we'd been in the room now for. And our room was room 9 in the clinic that we went to, and this was the room that we ended up going back to every time for checks. So we always knew, and I actually called it the doom room, is the way, because it was always a room of bad news for us.
And it's so interesting that you should say that, because I've been quite interested about how diagnosis is delivered for some time, and in another episode in the podcast we're going to be talking about scan anxiety and how you have that anxiety prior to your scan, and then the delivery of news, and whether it's done sensitively or not, and also do health professionals need more training in delivery of bad news? But the whole kind of my fascination around diagnosis, I think, came from listening to a fantastic podcast called Room 5. So it's so interesting that you picked up on Room 9 there, but this podcast is called Room 5, and it's by a lady called Helena Merriman, and she herself received a difficult diagnosis, not to do with fertility or pregnancy.
Mm.
And she remembers the room that she was in. She remembers all the feelings and the emotions, and therefore she's then talking to other people who've had a similar diagnosis. So if I can take you back to that moment when you were getting those ideas of kind of whispering, people were kind of looking at, and they called another doctor in, and all of that anxiety, which I'm sure started to raise your levels of anxiety and suspicion that something wasn't quite right. But then you get given that diagnosis. What did that feel like for you? What was that like? Take me back.
I mean, to be honest, at that point, we didn't actually get an actual diagnosis until 7 weeks later, but we knew that there was an issue. And so at that point where the doctor came in, and then the whispers changed, and then we were told again, congratulations, it's a boy, which I still found very strange because it was obviously precursing some bad news. And the part that they couldn't see was a part of the brain that connects the left and the right side of the brain together. So the doctor then explained that part. We had to go back to the waiting room, but it was still COVID rules and regulations. So my partner came to sit next to me, and he was, you need to move downstairs, and we need to sit separately. So even through that stillness of moment, and my brain just thinking, okay, what does that mean? The brain and the left and right side of the brain aren't connecting. We're thinking about different types of wiring and personalities, and all these sorts of things is where my brain was going. And I sat there as my partner went away, and obviously I got Google out, we all do it, to look at what potentially this was. And there is something called partial or total agenesis of the corpus callosum or callosome, and that's basically to do with this connecting part of the brain, and basically it sends messages between the left and right side of the brain to communicate. So we left with that part of news. We left with, do you want to do an amniocentesis? When do you want another scan? Do you want to wait till this time? And it was very kind of open, and very much what I would describe that we lived in was 7 weeks of limbo, which is very, very difficult. So what actually happened through those 7 weeks, and infertility is a roller coaster enough, is we had good news and then not so good news, and then good news and not so good news. And this wasn't at anyone's fault. It's because scanning and imaging, the brain's starting to really develop at that point, but scanning and imaging can only do so much. So in that time, I had numerous MRIs, numerous ultrasounds, and really I always work with my clients talking about this, but really advocating for yourself, making sure that the things are happening that you need to be happening, making sure you're asking the questions that you need to be asking. And it was very, very difficult, really difficult. And I remember that first weekend, that first Sunday, trying to understand what potentially could have been the diagnosis that I've just mentioned, and looking at Instagram accounts of mums who had babies with this, reading qualitative research of adults who didn't know they had it, because it's only something we can see with scanning nowadays, of how they've managed, and looking at, even trying to understand how to read an MRI myself, things like this. So that when I was in that moment through these weeks, and we didn't know how long it was going to be till we came to a conclusion. And when you're going through that, you may, like you're talking about, listening to a podcast or reading a book. And I can think of stories I heard before we had that news, just before the 20-week scan, thinking of a podcast I'd listened to where somebody had lost their baby, and thinking how out of the realms that was to anything that I was experiencing. And then suddenly it's you.
It's your reality.
It's your reality. And as you're going through the story and through the process, and through that time, you're suddenly reading things, and suddenly I got to this, it's a thing called a feticide. So it's basically giving an injection to your baby so that their heart will stop beating. And I remember reading that and thinking, I don't know how any parent who has wanted their baby so much can, how do they do that? How do they manage to make, because this really isn't a choice, it's a decision that you have to make. And suddenly it was us having to make that decision. And I'd say as well, I've got amazing support network, I've got amazing friends and family, but through that pregnancy I hadn't actually told many people. So at that point, through those 7 weeks, I was only starting to show just after that 20-week scan. So I
Mm-hmm.
started to wear very like much baggier clothes.
Mm.
And then people started to notice, and then I'd have to sort of be like, oh no, it's not good news, you know, and like a neighbour shouted over the road or something like this, because obviously you're going through all of this at the same time, but you're hiding from everything. And I remember one of my lovely consultants, because I work in a diabetes service in London, and I have a diabetes preconception clinic on a Monday, and she looked at me, and she looked obviously at my growing belly, and looked at me again, and that was the last week. That was that very last week. And I had to explain to her and say, and she was like, how are you doing the clinics and things? And I was like, I'm absolutely fine. I can switch off from this. And actually being busy, it wasn't an avoidance. It was the thing that I like.
Yeah.
I like to do. I like to support and help people, and I could switch on and off. But at the same time, through this process, going through all of this. So sorry, going back to you saying, what did you feel like? It, to be honest, numb. In absolute disbelief. But the reason I bring this up is because you don't get straight away information to be able to make a decision, because it was very up and down. On the Friday, we had news that they could see more of the structure, so it was better. So this happened it was the 1st of March, and it was a Tuesday. So we got to the Friday, it seemed better. So suddenly the weekend, you're feeling a bit lighter, and then you get different news, you know, by the start of the next week.
So that real roller coaster of emotions. Yeah.
It was, you know, obviously no sleep, obviously a lot of worry and anguish, and obviously then also telling family and telling people that do know, we're expecting a very different, you know, this is often when people are starting to think of nurseries and planning and doing things very differently, and we're very much hiding what's going on with us and keeping things very quiet. And also as a partnership, and I want to say this to people, that it's really difficult because you're both dealing with it in a different way as well.
Absolutely. You might not be on the same page at the same time, and that can be frustrating for one if one is being more positive and you're feeling a bit negative, and you're like, why are you being so positive? You're not always on the same page, are you? So we are delighted that this episode of the Fertility Podcast is sponsored by our friends at One Day Tests. Whether you're thinking about starting a family or are already trying to conceive, getting a blood test can be a really powerful tool to support you on your fertility journey. And let's face it, we all know that it's a journey that can be fraught with challenges and uncertainty. However, doing a blood test is really straightforward, and everything you need is in the box. I've just done one. And it's so simple. You press the lancet firmly down on your fingertip and gently massage your finger to allow the drops of blood to collect in the collection tube. Then you pop it back in the post. It's so simple. And getting a blood test done with One Day Tests can really help shed a light on things that can affect your fertility, such as your egg reserve levels, hormone imbalances, and other possible issues, for example, PCOS. More importantly, fertility blood tests can give you the insight to what you need and can empower you to take the most impactful next steps in your fertility journey. It will really help you take the guesswork out. One Day Tests offer a large range of fertility-related blood tests for both men and women at really affordable prices. It's super flexible and can customise your test and have it done at one of their 9 clinic locations, or if you're far away, don't worry, you can do it in the comfort of your own home using their home testing kits. Results are returned quickly with an easy to understand description, which you can access online and download to share with your healthcare practitioner. So to find out more, visit onedaytests.com, and you as a podcast listener can get a 10% discount by entering the code TFP10. So thank you to One Day Tests. They're really giving you the power to manage your health and your fertility. So when you were kind of going through all of this and then eventually you received your diagnosis and had to make this difficult decision, what was that like?
Yeah. So we ended up getting genetic testing. So we'd already had amniotic testing. We had further genetic testing of very rare conditions. And what it actually was a deletion on the short arm of chromosome 10. So something very, very rare that never happens. And it's nothing to do, there's no cause of it. It's genetics basically. And multiplication and the way cells divide. And we had already come to terms, and that was, say, the start of week 6 of this process. And I call it a process because it, in a sense, that's that medicalization of it, and then there's the actual emotional side to it as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
And we came to the conclusion, and we already knew we weren't. And what actually happened was we saw a pediatric neurologist, and just at the time we saw him, the genetics had come through, because they take a lot longer to come through. So we were waiting for all of this information. But we'd already sort of decided, unless there was really any hope or chance of anything being positive, that where we were going to be. So he concluded, and he said, you're doing the right thing. If this is where, that's the last conversation we'd had. This baby will have no life. He'll have 24/7 care. He'll have an IQ below 50. He won't have a life. And still you're feeling you're making this decision of this precious, precious little boy. And as I've said, and I've shared this on social media, that I'd rather have this pain than him to ever have a day of feeling any pain at all, and carrying, the loss of him.
Yeah. God, that's just made me, wow. Like you say, you're taking that pain, aren't you? You're taking that pain so that he doesn't have to experience it. Wow.
And so to be honest, when we actually got to having that diagnosis in that final week, I actually had relief. I had something, I was quite calm. And the midwife even said, when they did the process, when they did the injection, when they stopped his heart, and that's quite a process, because you actually see, you can ask for the screen they didn't actually move the screen, and my partner made a comment and I said, it's fine. You actually see them doing everything. You have to wait. You have to go back into the room to check the heart stop. So you've seen already, because they're checking that they're using the same. So you see his heart beating. You see the process. You see his heart not beating again. And then, you're spending, it's about 4 days, I think. So that was a Tuesday, 2 or 3 days before you're admitted. And it was actually 4 days before. So it was almost actually 2 years to the day, because it was Easter Sunday 2 years ago. So it was 17th of April that I delivered him. So actually there was some part of, we are doing the right thing. He will
made peace with your decision.
Yeah. And he will be okay. And someone said something really powerful to me, and they, just the way they said it, and they said, this isn't his time. And when they said that, that was one of the most calming things that I'd heard. And I could just, that was in that start of that final week. And that gave me a lot of calm of, it's okay. This just isn't the right time for him. And the whole process of being in hospital and delivery and everything else, again, one of those things, you read someone else's story and then you're like, okay, I'm doing this now. But I think in that week as well, I never thought about seeing him. I'd never thought about dressing him. I never thought about a funeral. And and then whilst I was in hospital, I still hadn't made these decisions. But I was 2 days into labour. I was like, I want to do all those things. I want to meet him. I want to have a funeral.
Did you name him? Because I know that sometimes can be a lovely way of. I know a lot of people are frightened to ask that question, but I think it's important, isn't it, to ask that question and to have him recognised as your baby.
We did, and that was all through that process of being in hospital, to be honest, that we made that decision. So we called him Alexander. And we gave him, I lost my dad when I was 16, so he's got my dad's middle name. And it was absolutely the right thing to do. And talking about angels, our celebrant who we had at the funeral was just the most amazing woman. The people working at the funeral directors gave me a call. The sensitivity and love and care they have for a baby and this whole process was overwhelming. And actually had that from people, you have no expectations. You don't know what position you're in. You're suddenly in this position, and suddenly the love and care that people are giving you through this process was absolutely overwhelming. And definitely for us, the process we did, I know we did the right thing. We got to say goodbye.
Absolutely.
And we have him in our hearts.
That must have been so important to mark that. When you talk about the other people and support, what was it like for you with regards to friends and family and helping them to understand the reason why you needed to make this decision? Was that always viewed positively, or did you receive some negative
Yeah.
responses as well?
Initially I didn't know how to communicate it with people, because you don't know what you don't know everyone's beliefs.
Yeah.
You have a baby, but you're potentially at that point going to make a decision not to continue with the pregnancy.
Mm.
And you actually, at first, I was everyone was overwhelmingly supportive of it. And, I talked it through. But at first, I don't think for a little bit I even said that we were contemplating that, or, that was even an outcome. And there wasn't anybody who wasn't supportive of it. I'd say um, the loss itself and the grief that people close to you have, so particularly like the grandparents, and holding other people's grief, and you haven't had this expectation of that part of it, it's quite there's a lot there that you obviously you haven't thought about before, but you're holding other people as well. Yeah, for
Yeah, you're
sure.
almost looking, and I can imagine with grandparents, the grief that they must have felt, and um, how you held that space for them. It's almost like another responsibility, isn't it? I know when I was young, my sister's quite a bit older than me. She's 18 years older than me. She'll hate me for saying that. And sadly, she lost 2 babies just after birth with both genetic conditions. And I remember the grief that I felt I think I was 11 the first one and 13 the second one. The grief that I felt at the loss of not being an aunt, which I was desperately looking to do, and that feeling, and how that I remember my sister apologizing to me, saying, "Kate, I'm so sorry." She didn't need to do that. And looking back now at 11 and 14 or 11 and 13, she didn't need to apologize to me at all, but she felt that she had to hold that space. So I do completely understand what you're saying, and from a different perspective, how difficult that must be. But the real happiness for you now is you were successful with a pregnancy, and you have your lovely little boy, Oliver, which is a great name. Same as my son's name. So it's a great name. But how did it feel, getting pregnant again and going through those anxiety? Because there must have been that anxiety that, gosh, is this going to happen to us again? What's this going to be like? Because I know getting pregnant after loss is particularly difficult. So how was that for you?
Well, I tell you what, we never went back to room 9. And that
Don't
was,
blame you.
and literally every time we're waiting to be where we were going to be called to. But it's not the most joyful experience. You still, we had that process up to the 20-week scan. There were moments, there was actually some repetition of calling in, and a doctor went out. There were certain things that happened in the same way. So my partner, I could hear them, and I thought everything was fine. But my partner was a little bit more worried and was checking.
Yeah.
And this time he thought there was something wrong with the heart, and it wasn't. It was okay. But there was just, and I don't think they'd known what happened before, but it was just, there was a certain way of communicating that is exactly in the same way. There's certain whispers, and there's a certain way someone went out of the room at the same time. So definite anxieties, definitely through the pregnancy until the point. And I've got to say, we went to an antenatal group and met some brilliant people there. And it was only then that I allowed it to be a reality of talking about, it was very late on talking about getting like clothes. We still haven't really moved house recently, so we haven't really set up the nursery yet, but we kept everything very, very simple. It isn't, you don't let yourself get carried away with thinking anywhere ahead. It's just take each day as it comes, and try to enjoy those moments.
Absolutely. It's finding the joy in the little moments, isn't it? Allowing somehow to allow joy to come in, even with all of this that's going on in your head. Anita, thank you so much for coming to talk to me about, as we said at the very beginning, is a very, very difficult subject. It's so interesting to have heard your experiences. I think you'll have touched the heart of everyone listening today, and absolutely for me, for sure. I don't know how I've kept the tears back, but I've just about managed it. But thank you for sharing everything so eloquently. Before I let you go, tell people where they can find you, because they might want to tap into your experiences, especially if they're worried or experiencing sadly something like you, but also your experiences of as a fertility dietitian. So where can people find you?
Absolutely, thank you. So yes, I am a fertility dietitian. So on Instagram, I'm at fertility.hormone.dietitian. I also work in diabetes, so I have another account which is at AnitaB_RD. So yes, I know it's interesting having the professional experience, but then also having the personal experience and really understanding how the process and how difficult all of this can be.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much to Anita for coming onto the podcast to talk about her decision to terminate for medical reasons. That's a really hard-hitting episode for sure. And one that I hope none of you ever have to face. What a hard decision to make. And it is the decision that nobody ever wants to have to face, isn't it? For sure. But really grateful that Anita could talk about it in so much depth and share her experiences. So on to the next episode in 2 weeks' time. I'm going to be joined by Ro Huntress, who is a fertility dietitian. And Ro is going to be sharing her top tips on fertility diet, all the things you know on how to optimize your fertility through your nutrition and lifestyle. So we're back in 2 weeks. So until then, bye for now. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fertility Podcast, which is brought to you by Nat Chat Productions. The music is composed by Parla. It's hosted by Kate Davis, and the episodes are put together by Ella Woodhouse and exec produced by me, Natalie Silverman. Before you click onto your next podcast, we'd love it if you could either click on the star ratings or write a quick review, as it's a brilliant way for others to know what you think. And even just hitting follow or subscribe really helps other people know it's worth a listen. Finally, just to say, you can follow the podcast on Insta at Fertility Poddy. Kate is at Your Fertility Nurse. And if you'd like to book in a consultation with Kate to understand more about your fertility and reproductive health, just visit yourfertilityjourney.com.